Hello, National University Academy students. This is Mr. Goyette. Just wanted to check in with you, AP students, AP U.S. History students who are working on your A version of the course. As VHS and NUA students, you're making your way into Unit 3, finishing up Unit 2. And some of you are looking at that Unit 2 quiz and thinking, how am I going to get through that? How am I going to prepare for it? I wanted to provide you with a few hints on where to start, what topics to look at, and I will give you some examples of the questions. Will Mollison asked the question this morning, is there a study guide for that? You'll notice on my YouTube channel that there are some study guides for some of the quizzes in both the A section of the course and the B section of the course. Right now I'm going to focus on Unit 2 for AP History A. So let's start with the evaluation of the growing population in the colonies. We talked about the Puritan lifestyle being one in the northern colonies whereby the population grew. It was a conservative, religious-based community where their belief in a strong work ethic and orderly society led to a very safe and nurturing society and an increase in the population. Therefore, natural production was most responsible for the rapid expansion of the American population during the 18th century. During the 18th century now. At this time, you'll also note that the Scots, Irish, and the Germans account for the bulk of non-English immigration into the colonies during the 18th century. And we'll look at the influence on our founding fathers of the Enlightenment thinkers, men like Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire. Their ideas, and those most specifically of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, are going to lead to the discussion of natural laws. Remember that according to the principles of Enlightenment, individuals were to make certain that public institutions, such as government, were constructed or developed according to natural laws. In the search of useful knowledge and inventions, Enlightenment thinkers also utilized something that, of course, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are big fans of, although they themselves make their errors. They are human. But they're fans of something called practical examination. And when I say fans, they're employing this idea that you use science and practical examination to come to conclusions. You don't just go out on a whim to come to your conclusions. So practical examination. Franklin organized a group around this time that discussed the latest European literature, philosophy, and science. One of these groups focused on mutual improvement and was called the Junto, Junto. A major source of political information vigorously put forth, especially in New York and Massachusetts, to exercise vigilance against the spread of privileged power was the weekly journal. The weekly journals were the way in which the media, the populace was informed through the media. They can't easily be compared to the media giants of today, but they were influential circulars that people read, and that's how political ideas were shared. During King George's War, also known as the War of Austrian Succession, the colonists scored a magnificent victory over the French by capturing Louisburg. The center of colonial government were the local assemblies at this time, and the climax of the 7 Years' War was the British General Wolfe's successful assault on Quebec. And we continued our discussion of religions during this time in the Great Awakening. Men like George Tennant were itinerant preachers spreading the revivalism of the Great Awakening. During the war known as King George's War, and we'll go back to that for a second, or the War of Austrian Succession, American colonists captured the French fortress Louisburg, only to have it returned to the French by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And of course, this was the King George's War and the War of Austrian Succession. Most Scotch-Irish immigrants to America settled in Pennsylvania at this time. And most Germans who settled in the middle colonies came to America primarily in search of land of their own. Your book will mention some coming for religious reasons, but it emphasizes that the big draw, the pull factor that we call in economics and geopolitics, is the big pull factor here is the idea of owning land of their own. This was something that was harder to do in Europe. The oldest permanent European settlement is what is now, what in the United States is what now is St. Augustine, Florida. The oldest permanent European settlement in what now is the United States is St. Augustine, Florida. You'll remember that Spain was here before, some of its colonies were here before the English colonies. Colonists who clustered along the Atlantic coast cities in the mid-18th century were culturally very similar to the English. So they had cultural and religious values that were shared by the English. The balance of trade between England and the colonies had turned so much to England's favor by the mid-18th century, chiefly because industrialization allowed England to sell a greater quantity of consumer goods at cheaper prices to American buyers. So, England found a market in the colonies. To cover the small but recurrent deficit of selling and buying goods from the British, the colonists relied on profits made in the West Indies. And as a product of the Enlightenment, Benjamin Franklin constantly pursued his numerous curiosities until they yielded new and practical ideas and were quite usable. Jonathan Edwards preached that God was omnipotent and the eternal fate of helpless individuals was determined at birth. So he believed in what we discussed in our first unit as predestination, or double predestination, as put forth by Calvinism and Calvin himself to a lesser degree. Jonathan Edwards was an outstanding theologian who relied on George Whitefield, a young, inspiring preacher from England who toured the colonies. And you'll want to look at on page 111 to brush up on your information on George Whitefield. Unlike the United States Constitution, the British Constitution was an informal and elusive body of laws, court decisions, and statutes. It was a very hodgepodge collection of what do we call it? Precedents, where it was, okay, because of this case, let's rule the following in this case. It gave them some insight in how to rule, but it was an informal, elusive body of laws, court decisions, and statutes. Few people spoke out against the constitutional abuses before 1760. The main exception was a group of radical publicists whom historians had labeled the Commonwealthmen. The Commonwealthmen. So this was before the outrage in the colonies that saw the abuses of King George as being intolerable. So the Commonwealthmen were the first to speak up. Whatever their demerits, royal governors in America in the 1740s and 50s possessed enormous powers. Remember, we talked about landed gentry and the ability to have money, land, and housing went a long way in politics. If you had no fulcrum, no power, no position, if you were not landed gentry. The factors made America ripe for a religious what factors made America ripe for religious awakening in the 1740s? You'll want to go to page 111 of your America Past and Present textbook. Whatever the origins, the seeds of the revival were generally sown on fragile ground. In the early decades of the century, many Americans, but especially New Englanders, complained that organized religion had lost its vitality. They looked back to Winthrop's generation with nostalgia, assuming that common people at that time had possessed a greater piety than did the latter, more worldly colonists. Congregational ministers seemed obsessed with dull scholastic masters. They no longer touched the heart. And in southern colonies, there were simply not enough ordained ministers to tend to the religious needs of the population. And on last one you'll focus in on is the Albany Plan. Let's talk about that for a second. What was the genius behind the Albany Plan? The Albany Plan is noteworthy in several respects. First of all, Franklin anticipated many of the problems that would beset the government created after independence, such as finance, dealing with the Indian tribes, control of commerce and defense. And in fact, it contains the seeds of a true union. And many ideas would be revived and adapted in Philadelphia more than 30 years later and included in the Constitution. After the plan was unveiled, the Crown did not push it, since the British officials realized if they adopted the plan, it could create a very powerful entity that His Majesty, King George, or any king for that matter, might not be able to control. In other words, it would give the colonies too much power. So the royal councilors need not have worried. The colonists were not ready for union, nor were the colonial assemblies ready to give up their recent and hard-won control over local affairs to central government. This would not happen until well after the American settlement had declared their independence. Okay, so review the Albany Plan. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to stop here. Hope you can review it and prepare yourselves for the quiz. Talk to you soon. Call, email, Skype if you have questions.